Thank you. And thank you for having me. I was very honored to be able to come here and talk to you today. What I'm going to share with you today is work that I do that I feel very passionate about, and I love sharing with other people. It was also super delightful to be able to come to Germany. I had never been in the country, but I did in college. We had to pass a language at a certain level, and I picked German because I read it was like the most rule oriented, and I thought I could get through it. And I studied German, which I don't remember much of because it was a long time ago, but I'd never come here. So it was really a treat to be able to come and visit this country that I spent quite a bit of time learning about and studying the language out. So I really appreciate the invitation. I'm a little worried this thing's going to keep coming up, but we'll ignore it. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about equity. All right. So equity is a topic of a lot of conversation in society at large. It's also something that we talk about a lot in STEM and that we talk a lot about in the mathematical sciences because it's a problem, particularly in STEM and within STEM, particularly in the mathematical sciences. And it gets a lot of attention. And there's been a lot of research around it, which has demonstrated the ways that equity is pretty problematic. And I pulled out here one study, this is not mine, it's just recent, to show you what some of this work looks like. So these are some folks, what they did was compare 32 intersectional groups. So what they did was look at race, so white versus not white, disability status, so able-bodied versus having a disability, which could be a physical disability or mental disability. Not all disabilities are obvious. Sexual orientation status, and gender. And they surveyed, I believe this was over 20,000 professionals in STEM about various dimensions. And what they found was that for those who were white, able-bodied, straight men, so that particular combination, they experienced more social inclusion than any other group, professional respect by their peers than any other group, career advancement opportunities, and salary, while experiencing less harassment in the workplace. And they looked to see if anything could explain this other than their specific identity, and the answer was no. So there are things that have an impact. So family responsibilities do have an impact, but it doesn't explain these large differences that we see in terms of access to things like respect and inclusion and salary. There are literally thousands of studies just like this, which all have basically the same conclusions and look at it from different aspects, right? So we know this is an issue. It's not up for debate. We know it is. We know a lot about how it plays out. And we have known that for a really long time. We've known that since I first started in the field. But what we're not seeing over time is things get better, even though we're documenting the problem pretty well. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but first I want to stop and I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by privilege. And this is not my class, but I really like it, so I pulled it up for you. Hopefully you can sort of see it because the words are small. But do you happen to have a laser pointer that I can point? So when I talk about privilege, there are many different identities by which you may be privileged or not privileged. And this is representing a lot of the more common ones, but not all of them, right? So gender is in here. One of the things that I like about it is that sort of the closer you are to the center. No, it's okay. I can manage without it.
It's no problem.
The closer that you are to the center here, right, the more privilege you have. And so along gender lines, let's see, where is gender? Gender's up here, right? So sort of at the center is a cis man. So cis means that your gender identity is the same, how you identify is the same as you were assigned at birth. And then as you sort of come out from there, there's cis woman, and then we get to trans and non-binary, right? So, you know, for me as a cis woman, I could be more marginalized than I am. I could also be more privileged than I am. Okay, so all of us have all kinds of different identities. So if you look here, there's your mental health status. There's the level of wealth in the household that you grew up in. There's gender, there's race. There's here the level of caring duties that you might have, right? So all of us have these intersectional identities related to like all kinds of different things. Are you in a place where you're speaking the native language, right? From you having to communicate outside of that, that place us sort of closer to the center or more on the outside. And so what I'm talking about today is this privilege. If anyone knows how to make that stop? Yes. Okay, I'll just keep turning it off. What's that?
Maybe just turn on the Wi-Fi.
Turn on the what?
Turn on the Wi-Fi.
She's in the Zoom or she's starting.
Oh, that right.
Right, so all of us, everyone in this room, right, is reasonably close to the center on net, because anyone who was way out on the outer side, they're not going to make it here. They're just not. It's just too much of a challenge, right? So we've all benefited in some ways by privilege, but my guess is that there's no one here who's completely at the center, right? So we all have identities in which we've experienced not having privilege and can identify with that. And what I'm going to talk to you today about when I talk about privilege, so I'm going to talk in the context of white men. That's the work that I've done. But I want to be very clear, it's not about white men. It's about what happens when you have a privileged identity. And because in the sciences, white men tend to be privileged, right? And so we use that particular demographic to talk about privilege because you can see it well with that demographic. But what we're talking about is that it's nothing specific to white men. It's specific to people who have high intersectional privilege identities. Okay, so I mentioned that we know that we have a lot of inequity in STEM and that we've known it for a long time. And there's a ton of research around it that's documenting it. And over the course of my career, when I first started, about 30% of undergraduate physics majors were women. And I thought, oh, by the time I'm my age, that would be 50%, right? Because we know it's a problem and we're doing a lot to address it. Here, many years later, it's still the same. Nothing's really changed, right? And so why is that? After all this time and all of this effort that we've put into it, do we still basically have the same problem? So I can tell you what doesn't explain that. It's not a lack of knowledge that it exists, right? Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of studies have been done documenting it, documenting how it plays out, trying to get at some of the underlying reasons. We know it's a problem. So it's not a lack of knowledge. We have knowledge. It's not that we don't want to change, right? In my experience, almost everyone there's always a few jerks, right? But for the most part, truly, people are good and they don't want there to be an unfair situation in life. And they have the desire to change this so that we are more equitable, right? By and large, most people are that way. We also see, even on an institutional and departmental level, just like this, right? You all invited me, right? Because you care about it, you all showed up and you want to see things happen that are different. So it's not a lack of wanting things to be different. It's also not a lack of willingness to put effort into making a change. And again, right, I mean, everyone's here. People are willing to put their time and effort and energy into making change. It's not that. It's also not a lack of opportunities to learn to do better, right? We saw here that Barbara introduced many of these opportunities that you all have to engage in that. That's true everywhere, right? So there's a lot of that. That's not the problem. It's also not a lack of funding. I mean, I don't know exactly what happens here in Germany, but in the United States, millions upon millions of dollars every year is being put in by the National Science Foundation toward understanding and addressing equity problems. I mean, we could put more money to it, but it's not really a lack of money that's actually causing this. So the vast majority of those who work in STEM do believe it's a problem. They want to change. They're willing to personally put time and effort into that change. And we have a lot of resources to support that. And yet we're not seeing change happen, not in a significant way. So this is a really interesting question, right? I mean, what else could it be? And why are we not shifting this direction? And I'm going to argue there's only one possible explanation, and that is that the model of how to make change happen is flawed. That the way that we're going about it, there's something about it that just doesn't work. And if we keep doing it the same way we've been doing it, we're going to keep seeing no progress. So what's wrong with the model? Well, let's look at what the model is. And so first of all, this isn't an intentional model by most people. It's just intuitive. We do what we think will work. And the current change paradigm is really focused on changing the people who have been historically excluded. Okay, so how does that work? So we see a lot of things like mentoring, scholarship programs, bridge programs. Bridge programs are in the US supporting kids as they make the transition from high school to college. Affinity spaces, so this is like women in physics clubs, workshops like this, where we're really working on changing the people who are oppressed. Now, I want to be really clear. These things are useful, they're good, they're valuable, but what happens is there's often a lack of something else. And each of these really, if you look under it, what are we talking about? We're talking about helping people who are oppressed be better prepared, negotiate better, right? I mean, I was paid less in the first, 4 jobs I had than comparable men. And I was told it's because I didn't negotiate well enough. I did negotiate. I was told no, the comparable man hired didn't negotiate at all and was offered a higher salary. It really isn't that. I can't just make myself better to overcome discrimination and bias that is happening. So I'm going to argue that the problem with our change models is that we're not focusing in the right place, right? We're not focusing on the power structures, and the people who have been historically over-included are remaining unexamined and unchanged. So I'm not critical of things like mentoring programs. I'm critical of mentoring programs without the corresponding focus on changing structures and people who have privilege. And I was really happy, Barbara, that you had on the slide both your mentoring stuff here and on the other side addressing those structures, right? But oftentimes that isn't done. We forget about that. So what I'm going to show you here today, my work has been focusing on that. It's asking for people who have these high intersectional identities of privilege, how are they engaging in equity efforts, and what can we learn by studying them in order to have a better change model? So this is a study that we did with my colleague here, Dr. Fedori, and we published a paper, which is the paper that brought me on your radar here. It took a while to get through peer review, but we did it, and it's now out. There's a citation at the bottom. And what we did was want to study people who have historically been over. And so we did interviews with 27 self-identified. We just said, you identified as a man, you identify as white, male physicists across the United States at 13 institutions. 13 of them were faculty. Most of the faculty were full professors. So that means that this is the highest rank you can go. They're senior, they're well-established, they've been very successful in their careers. 4 of them were currently chairs of the department, and these were primarily major research universities. So these are men that reached really high status within the field of physics. And then 14 graduate students who were at high intense research universities. We spent an hour or so asking them all kinds of questions. The full interview protocol is in this paper, the citation that I put. So if you're interested in finding out all of what we asked them, you can go look that up. And I want to make it really clear that this wasn't a representative sample. So here's how we got these men. We sent out an email and we said, you're looking for white men willing to sit down for an hour and talk about race and gender and physicists. Okay. Most white male physicists don't want to do that. They don't. So the people who signed up to, they knew what they were getting into. They weren't paid. It was all volunteers. So these guys they're the guys, they're like you all who showed up today, right? These are the guys who care enough to do this really uncomfortable, vulnerable thing for an hour because they do care. And several of them said, I signed up because I wanted to help and I didn't know what else to do. And if I can help by sharing my experiences, I wanted to. And so this is really important because these are sort of the most progressive men. These are also the men who would be expected to lead change efforts because they're the ones willing to put time and effort and energy into change. This is not your average physicist. And I want to try to come back to that because what we're going to find is that even though they were the most progressive men and they cared and were trying, there's still a lot that they don't understand. And a lot of ways in which they're actually undermining this thing that they want to contribute to. So what did we find? We found all kinds of stuff. This one was very salient. We found what we call this discourse a lot, discoursive distancing. And so these are ways in which when they talk about equity, they placed it outside their sphere of influence, right? So yes, it exists, and yes, it's a problem, but it's not a problem anywhere where I can actually have an influence on it. So I call this the not me, not my students, not my research group, not my department, and not my field. Because when they talk about it, it's just constantly doing this, constantly putting it somewhere else. So here's an example of this. This person said, she's talking about some data we presented. I mean, that view is out there in our society. I guess you'd be crazy to think there isn't some of it inside of STEM fields. Attitudes among engineers are a lot different than attitudes among physicists, in my experience. Okay, so he's just looked at data showing discrimination in STEM and explained it away by saying that that includes engineers. Physics is fine. There's no data that indicates that's true. Physicists are problematic, so are engineers, so is like everybody else. We see this pervasively. And if you go to the paper link, I see there's like, I don't know how many 10 or 15 quotes that get at this. We also see this distancing move in the way that they look at the problem. So there we ask them, why is physics so male? Why is physics so light? And when you look at their answers, they say things like, well, the K-12 system, so this is the system before you get to the university, discourages women and provides an adequate education. That's true, but it doesn't explain why physics is so much worse than every other field. They like to blame poverty, right? There's lots and lots of people of color who don't live in poverty and they don't go into physics, right? So it just doesn't hold up. It's an historical legacy. So this was particularly the grad students like this one. Oh, it's just all those old guys and they're going to retire and everything's going to be fine, right? Grad students said that, no faculty said that, because the grad students aren't the old guys, right? So again, it's just putting the blame on someone else. They also like to bring up family responsibilities and parenting. Women aren't in physics because they have a parent. Women have children in every single field that exists. Physics is a whole lot worse than all those other fields, right? So it isn't explaining what's happening in physics, but by going to these explanations that have nothing to do with physics, it sort of lets them off the hook, right? I mean, what can I do if women want to have babies? I'm at a university. How am I supposed to fix the K-12 system, right? So all of these are ways of just saying this is outside my sphere of influence. There's nothing I can do about it. Another discourse we see is this discourse of inaction. This is sort of it's not my job to do this. So this is, they don't say exactly what I've said here, right? But it's the essence of what we see. I'm not responsible for learning about or addressing it. Here's an example quote. I'm not great about stepping into that conversation and being productive about this. He's responding to like, how would you handle this situation that when you witness discrimination? My sense is, oh, that's awful, but then I don't do much with it. I don't feel like I have the tools to handle this productively. Okay. So this is a full faculty member, a senior person in the field. I mean, at what point is he going to develop the tools, right? He also hasn't taken responsibility. It is hard. It is really hard to step into those conversations. It is uncomfortable, but this is someone in the most senior, respected position. He's been in the field for a long time. Like, when are you going to get those tools? And it's important to get those tools because you're benefiting from not having to deal with this discrimination and not speaking up when you see it happen to other people. We also see a lot of minimizing. So yes, there's equity there or inequity there, but it's not really that bad. So here's an example. I think everyone has at least one negative story. Whether it affected them negatively or not is less clear because these are all people that have been successful. So this is the sort of like, well, all the women I know have been successful, so it must not have been that bad. Right? So I mean, I'm successful. I've been successful in the field, but I probably had to work 20% harder than I would have if I were a man. And that took away a lot of what I might do and prevented me from being even more successful than I was. And there are a lot of women that leave, right, because they're experiencing more. So it's just minimizing it. Like, oh, it's not that bad. I'm comfortable with it. Another way that we see minimizing that really stood out is one of the questions that we asked when we show them data on the number of women and people of color who reported experiencing discrimination in their workplace. And then we asked them when they said they were being discriminated against, what were they thinking about? Like, what kind of experiences led them to say that they had had this experience of discrimination? The most common answer we got were things that could be characterized as things that individual people did or said that created discomfort. So things like people making snide and sensitive comments, locker room talk, the types of stories you tend to hear, being confused for a janitor. So people of color sometimes get confused for the janitor. So, I mean, yes, these things happen. And yes, they're a problem. But this is minimizing. They were being asked about experiences with discrimination. And so the problem here is that these are all things that are harassment rather than discrimination. So harassment is something that happens like an individual, like jerk does, right? Compared to discrimination, which is embedded in systems and the cultures. Harassment, the impact of that is that the target feels kind of icky or uncomfortable. The impact of discrimination is that you lose your opportunities to thrive in the field. Harassment are things like microaggressions, unwanted sexual advances. Discrimination is things like, so I can get over, like, if you're just a jerk to me, I can ignore you. Now I can say, oh, that guy, right? But you're not going to pay me fairly. You're not going to acknowledge my work fairly. You're not going to hire me, right? Those are things that are really hard to overcome. And so harassment is a problem. And I want to be very clear that enough harassment will rise to the level of discrimination. But it's a lower level of what we're talking about, right? Discrimination is really hard to overcome, and it's systemic. About half our interviewees, when we specifically ask them of examples of discrimination, only mention harassment. Right, so I present this as an example of man-laxing, right? The locker room talk, as opposed to your contributions aren't being acknowledged and you didn't get the job that you were qualified for. Very different things. So they're just not seeing the seriousness of it. We see what I call like your discourses of gaslighting, so sort of blaming the victim. So this is sort of focusing on the people who are oppressed as the problem without acknowledging the racism or sexism that they're encountering or taking steps to stop it. So here's an example. If I had a student experiencing racial hostility in my class, I would try and get them in touch with whatever organization on campus specializes in working with these kinds of students to help connect them with resources and whatnot. So this was a situation, and we're going to delve into this in depth in just a little bit. We presented them on a student who was experiencing racial hostility in her classroom, a real student and a real story, and said, what would you do if you were the instructor? And he says, oh, I help that student get in contact with somebody else. Right? It's not the student's problem. It's the people who are racially harassing her's problem, and they're the ones that need to be fixed, not her. She's fine. She just needs that to stop. There's also, by the way, here in this, you can see this othering these kinds of students, right? Probably didn't even realize he said it, but you can hear in that an othering rather than seeing her as this sort of fully human being who's experiencing this. So it's sort of saying with her problem, she needs to figure it out, right? Somehow to endure it or whatever. I don't know what he had in mind. Pretty much all of these, what we call deficit model solutions, so this is sort of what I was criticizing a bit in the beginning, can fall into this, where it's like, oh, we need to get more women, or training more to women to do better, or whatever. It sort of conveys the message that, I felt it, right, as I've been through all of these, like, oh, maybe I'm not. Maybe I just need to work harder. Maybe I need to negotiate better. Maybe I am not prepared. Maybe I don't have enough confidence. Is that it? I'm just not confident enough? And if I could be more confident, they would acknowledge what I'm doing, right? And so you start to question it in yourself. Maybe it is me, because everyone around you is giving you the message that somehow you need to do something different. But it isn't, right? It's the system around, not the people who are being impressed. So these are the ones that I just talked about. Distancing, which is sort of like, it's a problem, but it occurs where I have no power. Inaction, it's a problem, but I don't have to act if I'm uncomfortable or if someone hasn't told me how to act. Minimizing, it's a problem, but it's not that bad. Evasiveness, there is a problem, but it isn't about race or gender. I think actually took that slide out because I was worried about time. And then gaslighting, the sort of. So these are just, there's more in there, right? I mean, there's just a limit to what we can do, where we just see these pervasive patterns of speech that are just problematic and are ultimately undermining. Remember, back I told you, these are all really progressive men who were willing to sit down and talk to us and actually care a lot and are trying. They really are. They really care. And they're still falling into this. And again, it's not, I just want to emphasize, it's not white men. This is what we all do. All of us do it. We're in a position of privilege around our privileged identity. This is sort of how human beings respond when you're in that side of the dynamic. So I wanted to share with you what I'm printing out for my next paper in the same data. You're the first person to see it. I haven't ever shared it before, so yay, pretty eyes. And I'm still working through it, right? So it's a little preliminary, but I'm excited about it and about what it shows in like me. And that is, what is the role of empathy and emotion, right? What role does that play in what we're doing here? So this is something that's interesting, right? Physicists, mathematical sciences, we never talk about emotion. We never talk about empathy. Right? We're just like, oh, let's stay away from that. And I think that's a big problem. And I think it is related to why the mathematical sciences have more of an equity problem than some of the other fields do. And this is just a quote I really like. Nothing's more important than empathy for another human being's suffering. Nothing, not career, not wealth, not intelligence, certainly not status. If we're going to feel for one another, if we're going to survive with dignity. And this is not how scientists often operate, right? To be very status-oriented at the expense, perhaps, of empathy. So I want to look at the data, and I'll say how I got into this, right? There's this one passage where I'm going to show you one particular question that we asked them, in which I noticed a lot of them, the immediate response had a lot of emotion in it. And so I got curious about that. So this is when you do a qualitative research, you follow your data. It's like, oh, I see a lot of emotion here. Probably matters. So you start delving into it and looking at it and collecting things and thinking about it and try to make sense of it. So before I show you that, I want to define for you how I'm using some of these words. Empathy is different from sympathy, right? So I'm using it in a way that emotion researchers use it. There's a field of emotion research, and this is how they use it. So sympathy is I'm sorry for your pain, right? So this is the sort of like when someone died, oh, I'm sorry for your loss, right? So it's truly like, I can see this person suffering, and I don't want them to suffer. I'm not enjoying your suffering. But there's a distancing or othering quality to it. It's like, I'm not suffering, that's you. I don't want you to suffer, but you're there, that's sympathy. And you all know, we've all been on a receiving end of sympathy, and it's usually, you're like, okay, but it doesn't feel great. It doesn't really help when you receive that. Empathy is a little different. Empathy is sort of, I see you're in pain, and I understand that pain. I've had that pain. I feel bad that you have that. Feel your pain, right? It's really connecting with the other person and the suffering that they're having in the way that's not the other, right? That's sympathy. And it involves, this is really important, it involves perspective taking. So it involves understanding what it's like to be that person. So maybe I've never had this close person to me die, but I can imagine what it would feel like in a real way, and I can connect with you around that. I can imagine what it's like to be you in this situation, having that pain in a real and honest way. That's enough. And then we can level up from empathy to compassion. And so compassion is defined sort of as the empathy with a compulsion to act. I have so much empathy with you, I can't help but try to alleviate your suffering, right? I see it that you're suffering, I feel it, I have to do something to alleviate that suffering. That's compassion. So sort of the highest level of this. So that's how many use these words, and come back to that. So this is the passage that we presented to them that elicited all of this. So this is from a research study, Angela Johnson, who also does research in the field. And this is a student, so I'll read it. So they read this. One day I walked into a huge lecture hall and saw down at the front one of my informants, Zena. So this is a made-up name, but the person's real, the story is real. A tall, dark-skinned African-American woman. She was sitting in an aisle seat. The rest of the row she sat in was empty. I sat through the class with her, and at the end of the class, she told me that whatever row she sits in, she clears it out. No one will sit within 5 or 6 seats of her. She explained that she used to sit in the 6th row all by herself. Recently, she had moved to the 4th row, which previously had occupants. Now, as I saw for myself when I looked around, the 6th row held a number of students, and the 4th row was empty. This is a very common experience that particularly Black women in the United States have. So like my colleague who was on this, she says, oh, it's great when I go on public transportation, it's really crowded. It's fine for me here. Everyone moves away from me, right? In class, people move away from me. It's a very common experience that people of high intersectional oppressed identities have, sort of the opposite of the high intersectional privilege. And it's not one that people with privilege often realize or understand. It's happening very well. So we had them read this. There was a little bit more to it. We had them read it. And then we asked them a long follow-up questions. The first question was, all right, what's your response to this? Right? But we just didn't read it. And tell us what comes up for you. What do you feel first when you read this? And this was the place where I saw a lot of emotion that led me down the path of looking more into it. We also asked them what they would do if they were a professor and this were happening in their class, right? So we know how they would handle it when they're in charge of a situation where this is happening. So what were the emotions that they expressed? I said we saw a lot of emotions. So I went and I looked at what emotions they expressed. And these were the emotions they expressed immediately after, not prompted, immediately after reading the passage. So 10 of them expressed no emotion. That doesn't mean they didn't have emotion, of course. It just means they didn't express it. But we do tend to express emotions that we feel intensely. So sort of the more intense the emotion we feel, the more likely we would be to verbalize it. Emotions associated with curiosity, there were 4. So here's an example. I don't know why this would be happening. It's very hard for me to process. Why would people do that? So curiosity is kind of a neutral emotion. It's not particularly positive or negative. It's just interest. It's like, oh, I'm interested in this. All 4 of these also expressed other emotions. No one was only curious, but we did have 4 that expressed that. And then we have emotions that are associated with depression. So sadness. And this was a lot of people. This is 14. This is really, really sad. The fact that would be a student's experience just really saddens me. So sadness was by far the most common emotion that was expressed, and it was very common. But these are emotions, depression is not an active emotion. There's a hopelessness, a powerlessness, a like, I'm still really sad about that quality to this particular emotional response. Emotions associated with anger. Now, anger is where you start getting action. How do you that? I'm pissed off about that. I'm going to do something about it. We're 4 people who fell into that category. So here's an example. That's incredibly sad and depressing and infuriating, right? So this is someone who was in the depression side of things, but also had the infuriating part. So would have been categorized in both of these categories, right? They had that range. And so anger is where you start having, like, when you're angry, you want to do something, right? You want to go make something happen or make a change, as opposed to the sort of hopelessness that you might feel around sadness. And then what about outrage? I mean, outrage is where you can't help but go do something. Nobody will go on a category. Now, I haven't tried this, but I'm pretty sure that if I had 27 Black women read this passage, there'd be a lot of outrage that would be expressed immediately after reading that. And we didn't see any of that with it's not that they didn't feel it yet, right? I mean, not how plug into their brain, but they didn't express it. So if you think about, remember the sympathy, empathy, compassion, right? The sort of sympathy might be sort of the depression side of things, empathy coming up there in the sort of anger side of things, but true compassion, like sort of that I have to add, definitely some of that in the anger. But what you can see is that they're more on the sort of, more of them are more sympathy maybe, or potentially just, we tend to express nothing. So it's really going on with them. So here's the interesting part. I was like, okay, does this matter? Does it matter what their emotional response is? No, what we really cared about is what they do. Right? What do they actually do? How do they show up in the world? And so remember, we asked them, if you were a professor of this class, what would you do if this happened? So well, how does that connect to the emotions that they express? So they were asked later in the interview, after they had already had their expression, what would you do in your classroom? And this is a really complicated analysis I can share with you if you're interested, but I'm going to summarize it here. I've been into a couple big categories. So one is the number of people who's suggested action as the instructor of the course, so the person in charge of the course when that was happening, was something that would not be expected to have make any difference at all. So some of them are just like, I wouldn't do anything, or I wouldn't know what to do. There was I would encourage Zena, I talked to Zena about, why don't you get up and move? Why don't you ask for study? You do more to connect with these people, or go ask for advice, right? Just solutions that just want to actually address it. And then we see people who fell into what I categorize as weak action. So these are solutions, they're okay, right? And we just something, they're doing stuff. They're addressing the physical isolation. So I would assign seats so that she has to sit next to somebody, or I would do group work, right? So just sort of force a situation so that she's not just going to be off by herself. So this is a decent thought, and it's a good. I mean, there's some thought to this and to addressing it, but what's wrong with it? What's missing?
Jesus intentions love us.
Yeah, it's missing. So here, I'm going to show you from a different research study, a different Black woman talking about a similar experience that sort of explains it. So this is Serena. Serena was a very high achieving Black woman, and she's explaining why she left STEM. She says, the final straw for me was I had a lab, and it was me and two white guys and a white woman. And one of the guys, he didn't talk very much. The other white guy, he'd talk over me and the other young lady in our lab group. He'd always challenge me if I had an idea different from his and call over the TA. The TA is the teaching assistant who's helping to settle a dispute. If I happened to be right, he would just be, okay, let's move on. But if it was him being right, he'd be like, I knew I was right and making a big deal out of it. He would challenge me in ways that he didn't challenge anyone else in the group, including the other woman. That was actually the last bio class I took. So in this interview, she was explaining many different racialized and gendered experiences that she was having. But this was the one where she's just like, I just don't want to put up with this. And what she said was, I love biology. I didn't love it enough to put up with that all the time. So if you put the students in groups, you address the isolation, but it might actually make it worse because those students aren't going to respect her. They're not going to listen to her. They're not going to treat her well. Right, so the final category of this that I called strong action are solutions that acknowledge and address that as well. So use group work, but also put structures in place to monitor for problematic student-student interactions and to help the students, because they're probably not doing it intentionally, right? I mean, it's probably aren't awful people who are doing this. They're probably not aware of it, knows what's going on. But helping all of the students learn to work together, to treat each other properly, and then monitoring and intervening when they start to go in this direction. So that would be a strong solution to this. So we have these. So I want to show you how this connected to their emotion. So the blue here are people whose answer was classified as basically they're not doing anything. The orange are people who address the isolation. And then the gray are people who had a pretty decent solution to how to address it. So for those who expressed the 10 who expressed no emotion, we see that most of their solutions weren't solutions. They basically weren't going to address it. For those who had the passive emotions, so these were sadness, frustration, disappointment, they did a little bit better, right? So they were a little bit more on the weak action side. And then for those who had these anger, disgust, active emotions, we start to see a little bit better. It does seem that the initial emotion that they expressed is connected to the quality and depth of the solution that they were able to come up with when they were asked what they might do with this. So the thing I looked at is to see who do they express sympathy for, whose perspective we understand. These are kind of similar questions. So of course they express sympathy for Zena, some of them. So here's an example. I mean, that would be awful. Dealing with this sort of alienation would be awful. So this person's getting it. You know, like Zena's not enjoying it. This is help for her. But we also see them expressing empathy for Zena, taking Zena's perspective in ways that are just wrong. It's just not her perspective. So here's an example. There's not much you can do to change people's minds that's not going to cause a scene and disrupt the class. Even if you want to start a fight on the other students, they may not want that. So they, like Zena, trust me, if they're Black, they're used to it by now, unfortunately. So he's taking Zena's perspective, but he totally missed it. Zena is not like, oh, I'm used to it, that's fine, and no, I don't want you to do anything. and not be a good response to that. If you're having this experience in a class, you want your instructor to address it. You're not a parent, right? So we see this, like, sort of trying to imagine what it's like to be her, but really not understanding it. And also, I mean, you can see in here, like, basically public things proud, even though it's not. So for the participants identifying what I would call as a likely real impact on Xena, we had 4, and they identified the impact is that Xena would feel bad. So this is sort of like the one up at the top, that it wouldn't feel good for her. 3 indicated her opportunities to thrive would be impacted. She wouldn't have the same opportunities to learn as the other students. So this is a little concerning because this is 3 out of 27, right? Who, in discussing what would happen, how they might deal with it, recognize that this is truly going to impact her ability to thrive. Okay, so surprisingly, I was surprised at how much this was. We saw a lot of empathy directed toward the students who were doing the isolating. So here's an example. You can't coerce other students to change their behavior because at that point you're in a position of power, and it's not really right to use your power to shame people into doing things. It's bad that they're treating this person awfully, but it would also be bad to punish them irreparably. So what he's reacting to here is these students who are isolating her, they'll feel bad if I call them out on it. They'll feel shame, so I can't shame, right? He's having more empathy for these students than he is for Xena, who's experiencing an isolation. And this was common, actually. So over half of our participants, even though we didn't ask the question directly, we never said, they on their own, over half said, well, if I were an instructor, I wouldn't actually directly address the racism or the sexism because that would make the students feel bad. They'd be angry, they would be hurt by who were doing the isolating. So their empathies tend to lean more to the students that are creating the problem than they do to the student who's receiving this harassment discrimination, which, as I showed you with Serena, makes her want to not be in the field, right? So to summarize the part on empathy, privileged people can fail to empathize with oppressed people while having empathy for those who are held accountable for being oppressive. And this is just about, this is how we are, right? So they've done studies where they put people in MRI machines and they show them images of different colored hands, the printer, the needle. Our brains respond more to people whose hands look like ours, right? It's a physical response that happens. But we can also learn to do different. It's not an excuse for not doing different. And empathy is related to action, right? The emotional response that people have does impact how they engage in the situation. And that makes it really important to talk about empathy and to work on this perspective taking aspect in terms of how we address equity. So how do you do that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is all, I'm just kind of getting into this too, because it's where my data is taking me. Storytelling, I think, is a way, right? So that's why I showed you Serena's story instead of just telling you this is the problem, because when you hear through story, the voices of real people, it helps to connect with them better. It helps to do that. I suspect there's also something here to body work, right? This idea that oppression, privilege is something that we feel and carry in our bodies, and working through that involves doing things in our body. This is a book I highly recommend, which is all about that, which is what he's talking about, that we carry oppression in our body, we carry the trauma, and even being privileged, right? He's like, it's not cakewalk if you're white, right? You also carry racial trauma when you're on the privileged side of it. And doing exercises to work through that. I suspect this is also part of what would be helpful. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to take you through this last little bit here because I want you to understand this is all qualitative data. And qualitative data is great for getting a really good, solid understanding of why things are happening. the leaders 27 win. Like maybe our 27 weird win. They're unusual. Like maybe I'm interpreting the data incorrectly. The most powerful research to me uses both qualitative and quantitative. Because quantitative can tell you about large numbers of people. It doesn't give you depth, but it can tell you about how applicable, how broad your findings may be. So this is a survey that we gave. It's part of a larger project. Anyway, we got over 1,000 math, chemistry, and physics faculty to take our survey. This is with a bunch of other fabulous people, one of which is sitting here. This is my collaborator and husband, Charles, who was part of this project as well. And so we asked them all kinds of questions about the stuff. And I can't share everything with you, but what I want to show you is the survey. Actually, we found the same thing that I found in this qualitative data. So one of the questions that we asked them is, in your professional, well, this is exactly it. Have you ever experienced discrimination in a professional setting in your field based on your true or assumed gender? So I want to show you a little bit about how we categorize this, because this is not that easy to report this. We wanted to break it out by gender and race groups, okay? So we categorize the gender by cis men. So remember, cis just means that your gender, so these are people who were born and identified as man and still identified as man. And then add everybody else. So trans people, all over were in the marginalized gender, non-binary people go in the marginalized gender, right? So it's sort of privileged in gender, marginalized in gender. And then the same thing around race. So white is privileged, everybody else, even though there's different degrees of being marginalized, we put in the marginalized category. And so what we find, is that, yes, if you are marginalized in gender, you are more likely, to report having experienced discrimination. And the same thing for race, is that if you are white, there's a decent chance that you're going to experience racial discrimination. And then we asked them, so we know it's common, right? And then we said, over the last 3 years, have you witnessed discriminatory behaviors in your field, in a professional setting? And what you see here, right, is basically what I found with my qualitative, which is that the more that someone is down here on the privileged side, the less they see and understand what's happening for the people who are around them. So sort of women of color are like, yes, and cis white men, some of them said yes, but a lot of them didn't. Now the reality is all these groups probably witness the same amount, right? They're just less sensitive to it. So for the folks who said yes to this, we asked a follow-up question, and that's this next one. Consider the most recent time you brought attention to the discrimination in a professional setting. What was the result? And they had multiple responses. We've only plotted 2 of them here. The blue is whether they were satisfied with the result or not. And the orange is, did you experience negative consequences? And so what you see here is that for the people who are minoritized in both gender, so first of all, let me point out that in terms of I was satisfied with the result, I mean, white men were the most satisfied, but only 38% of them were. So the reality is that most people, when they tried to bring attention to it, did not get satisfactory results, even for white men. And this is a huge problem, right? Because if we can't give voice to it and have our voices heard and acknowledged and acted on, how we've ever been make progress. And if you are a woman of color who, right, remember this, the ones who are actually noticing what's going on, they're also the ones who are ignored when they try to speak up. White men, who are less likely to notice it, are the ones who are acknowledged more. They're still not acknowledged nearly as much as they should be. And then for the negative consequences we see, right, and this is important, white men often don't experience negative consequences. And then as you get more marginalized, you do. So women of color who are the most likely to understand it's happening are the least likely to be listened to if they speak up, and the most likely to be punished. In fact, they're far more likely to be punished than they are listened to. This is a huge problem. When I saw this, I'm like, how could we possibly make progress? How could we possibly make change when the system responds this way to people giving voice to the oppression that they're seeing or experiencing? And the answer is we wouldn't expect progress, right? We just wouldn't. So this is something that has to be fixed. And then finally, this is my last one. We also asked them basically, have you been a member of a group or committee dedicated to taking equity action? This was in 2019. And you can see again that basically the people who are privileged are the least likely to be engaged in learning. But they're the ones that need to do it the most, the ones who understand the least and should be doing the most, but they're actually doing the least. And again, this is really the problem. So I just want to end with like a little bit of, what do you do from here? Right, so if you're in a privileged position, I'm white. As a white person, I can speak up. I'm more likely to be listened to. I'm less likely to be punished. It's super important. That's why it is super important that I do, because of that. So how do you do this? One, have humility. By that, it means there's a lot you don't know. Every identity by which you're privileged, there's a lot that you don't know and understand, and you have to listen to and believe people who are oppressed when they try to explain it to you. And that is true, as much as I do this work, I'm constantly learning about race and how racism plays out, and I'm still screwing up and making mistakes because I don't understand it. And I'm trying and I read and they talk about it, right? And never, if you're a privileged person, you're never going to arrive and understand it all. It's a continuous process of listening and learning. There's the learning part. Take responsibility for learning, to recognize oppression and to engage productively. Don't just say, oh, it's hard, I don't know what to do, therefore I'm going to go do my research. Right? Learn what to do. It's important to matters. Empathy component. When you do engage, make sure you're engaging from your heart and not performatively. So performatively is like, oh, I'm going to go post on Facebook how outraged I am this is happening, but then you're not actually going to speak up and do anything about it, right? So make sure that you're doing it from a place of care for other people and compassion. And then finally, you can't do it by yourself. You have to have a community around you because it's systemic, right? None of us individually are responsible for this. It's not our fault as individuals. It's a systemic thing, and it has to be dealt with systemically and within a community. So find that community around you, focus on changing structures rather than individuals, mostly that support privilege and those who benefit from it. So I want to have a little bit of small group discussion, but let me take just a minute for questions and then we'll do that.
Go ahead.
So you gave the example of this, like the racial harassment in classroom setting, and you also said that there was like the action of professors or teachers in the situation. You focus on the victim instead of like addressing the aggressor in that situation. And I'm just wondering that why in academia is the bar so high to actually put in place a disciplinary action or something in the case like people misbehave or even actually transgress? Because it seems like the people who are the aggressor in those situations, they keep on getting higher aggressorships and so on. I'm just wondering if there's some indication more.
Yeah, so I don't know that it's exactly true that they're more likely to do this. It's just that they are quite likely to not sufficiently address it, and it really drains from what we did. And your other question about why academia is so bad, it's a very good question. I don't have a full answer to that, but it's a lot of culture and structures and precedent, what we reward people for, right? So you can be I don't know what it's like here in the United States, you can be a terrible instructor and you can still get promoted to full professor, right? And so there's not this, you're not incentive to learn to be different. And it's made up in all these tiny little structures and cultures, and no way of that pulls out. Well, and maybe you will see the being with problem. I'm not sure. So he said that he thinks
words and stuff, another physics or again, the mathematical sciences, physics, engineering, computer science, just from they tend to have worse outcomes with equity, and then kind of followed by chemistry. And then when you get into like biology, you tend to get a little bit better, but it's a problem else. But it's been like engineering I don't know. Yeah, physics, math, and engineering. Those are like these into these things. Okay, so I'm gonna have more conversation discussions, but I want you guys to talk with each other. So here's what we're gonna do. I would like for you to get in groups of 3. And I know it's kind of uncomfortable, but try not to tell the person you're sitting right next to right now. I encourage you to do that. It'll be more beneficial for everyone if you talk to someone that you don't already know really well. And then when you get in your group, so this is, I know this is weird. It's, this is, I'll do this, but I promise you, this is going to be good. I want us to do deep listening to each other. So once you get in your group, take out your phones and set a 2-minute timer. Okay. Each person will talk for 2 minutes about whatever you want to talk about. I put some prompts up here that you might think about, that you might respond to. But for 2 minutes, just simply share whatever you want to share about what I talked about, the reaction to it, what your thoughts are, uninterrupted for 2 minutes. And if someone doesn't take the whole 2 minutes, just let the timer keep going. You just sit in silence and just think about what they just said. Okay, don't rush to move on. And then at the end of 2 minutes, that person has to stop. Again, just keep going. Right, so this does 2 things. One, those quiet people who sit at work and think a lot and actually have a lot to say, encourages them to speak. And those who talk all the time, they could really do not to. You still get your 2 minutes, but then, let someone else talk, right? And then after each person in your group has shared for 2 minutes, then just talk about whatever. Let people listen to each person and share for 2 minutes first. And then we'll have a whole conversation. Right, so go find a new person, getting it like timers, and have a